1.9 million Gazans are currently living in the Israeli-established humanitarian zone spanning through central to southern Gaza, according to the latest Israeli military estimates. Now, that is more than 80% of the Gaza Strip's population that's clustered together amid ongoing fighting between Israel and Hamas. Now, despite repeated warnings of the risk of famine in the enclave, there have been major issues in distributing humanitarian aid. Earlier this week, aid workers began moving tons of aid, millions of tons of aid that had piled up at warehouses right next to the United States-built pier off of the Gaza coast, which has been temporarily closed due to rough seas, and it's not clear whether or not it will be opened again as a result of these delays in getting that aid distributed. Now, AIDS groups have struggled to transfer goods to Gaza's most needy population as a result of general lawlessness in the enclave, with gangs, desperate civilians, and also Hamas fighters looting these aid convoys. And joining us now on Skype is our veteran war correspondent, Arwa Damon. We also have our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Oseran, with us here in the studio. So, Arwa, first, paint us a picture of the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza at this point.
Let's start off with this designated so-called humanitarian zone, because it's not necessarily what you would imagine. The areas that have been designated a humanitarian zone are, first of all, constantly shifting. So people end up moving from one location to another. Secondly, there is no proper shelter. It's basically, imagine apocalyptic, end of the world rubble all over the place, with people pitching tents on top of rubble, in some cases where there are still bodies believed to be buried underneath, trying to pull blankets across, what was a wall of a home and setting themselves up inside the skeleton of what remains of a burnt out house, or clustered along this beachfront area that's known as Moesi. There is no access to proper food. There's no access to proper water. There's absolutely zero sanitation. Children are running around barefoot next to open sewage. There's a high prevalence of disease. So call it what you will, but you really can't call this level of inhumane living to be a humanitarian zone. And add to that the reality that even within these designated humanitarian zones, there are no real guarantees of safety, because the bombings still continue to come at any point in time in really any place. Now, when it comes to the distribution of humanitarian aid within Gaza, organizations are facing, what is basically multi-tier challenges. You really get the sense that there is this sort of descent into anarchy that is really being driven by both the sheer desperation, but also the fact that no rule of law exists right now. And with that, you see the emergence of gangs, of criminal elements who are trying to loot these trucks, mostly, though, to get cigarettes. A big industry right now, because Israel effectively banned the entry of cigarettes into the Gaza Strip since October 7th, is cigarette smuggling. One single cigarette, depending on the brand, can sell from anywhere from $17 to around $25. So if you manage to shove 5 cartons of cigarettes onto, an aid truck, that's around a $25,000 payday. And people are so afraid right now of what they're calling the war after the war they're going to have to deal with because of this chaotic situation that has been allowed to emerge within the Gaza Strip.
Now, there are a couple of different, topics that you spoke about here that I want to address, but I first want to talk about the issue of hunger and famine. You were in Gaza back in April. At this point, several months have passed. Are Gazans on the brink of famine, as we have seen, according to many recent UN reports?
Yes, and let me explain a bit more about what happened. So we heard the first famine warnings emerging earlier this year in January and February. And then what we actually saw in March and April was a moderate increase in the entry of aid and in the ability to distribute aid. So those initial warnings of this imminent famine that we heard earlier this year were staved off to a certain degree. With the offensive that happened in Rafah on May 7th and the shutting of the Rafah border crossing, access to aid has significantly decreased. So the access of aid into Gaza has decreased. And then because of the desperation, because of all of the elements I spoke about earlier, humanitarian organizations' ability to distribute aid within the Gaza Strip has significantly decreased. And it's not just because of these criminal elements and the looting and the lawlessness. It's also because deconfliction and coordination between humanitarian organizations and the Israeli side never really has worked in the way that it's meant to work. I'll give you one example. When I was there, I was trying to accompany a mission that was going to be delivering a truckload of fresh vegetables from the south to the north. The mission originally got permission to make this journey. And the reason why it needs permission is because in crossing from the south to the north, you're effectively crossing through this sort of strip that Israel has used and that it currently patrols and controls, dividing the Gaza Strip. The morning of the delivery, we were told, actually, no, you can't take the truck you wanted to take. We wanted to take a closed back truck because of the looting. The Israeli side had initially approved it, then that morning said, no, you have to take an open back truck, and it was impossible to scramble an open back truck quickly enough. So we decided to shove as much produce as we could into a Jeep and make the trip ourselves because our vehicle had been approved. We then got delayed for roughly 5 hours at what's known as the holding point, being told you can cross, you have the green light, no, you can't, back and forth, back and forth. So that's like one basic small mission to deliver a small amount of vegetables that really took an extraordinarily lengthy amount of time. The other challenge is...
Well, Ara, I just want to give our Middle East correspondent a chance to add to this right now. We're seeing kind of very much differing reports on the Israeli end as to what the situation is when it comes to hunger. There are reports indicating that there is certainly an issue with aid getting into parts of the north of the Gaza Strip, but famine is not what is happening in the rest of the Gaza Strip. Can you break this down for us?
According to the IPC, that's a UN-linked organization, there is no famine anywhere across the Gaza Strip. However, the situation in the north is the most dire because that is where, as Arwa described, the aid is most challenging for the aid to reach there. I think there's 2 points that we need to remember. First of all, there's the challenge of bringing aid into the Gaza Strip, and so far, the only port of entry that is not fully active is the Rafah border crossing, but aid isn't going through there because that's an Egyptian decision. Israel is not preventing the entry of aid through the Rafah border crossing from Egypt. And in the meantime, truckloads, hundreds of truckloads, and the supplies inside them are just sitting in the hot sun. That is one thing we need to remember. Another thing is, inside the Gaza Strip, yes, that is the main challenge. How do the supplies, the much-needed aid, how do they get from the humanitarian organizations? How are they dispersed? Now, these gangs that are taking over some of the convoys, these gangs aren't operating alone. There is one sole ruler in the Gaza Strip, and that is Hamas. We're seeing images of these gunmen. They do not operate without at least the tacit approval of Hamas. And we also heard at the beginning of May, the White House acknowledging that Hamas has been commandeering some of these aid convoys. And that indeed makes it a very challenging task for these organizations to operate freely inside of the Gaza Strip. Yes.
Now, there's another topic that I want to turn to that you mentioned, Arwa, and that was kind of the issue of so many people being in what you're saying is not really a humanitarian zone because of the conditions there. Israel usually issues directions for civilians in Gaza to leave specific areas ahead of imminent military activity there. On Monday's order, the one that we saw there, it followed one of the largest rocket barrages fired towards Israel in recent months coming from Khan Yunis. So I'm talking about, of course, the movement of people from Khan Yunis towards areas of this humanitarian zone. The question is, how is the IDF supposed to avoid harming civilian life while targeting Hamas that is deeply embedded in civilian areas without leading to internal displacement? What is the other option here?
Look, there's a couple of options, and the issue is not necessarily the internal displacement per se. It's that the internal displacement happens without the ability to pre-position humanitarian assistance to receive those who have been displaced. That is one point. The second point is that if you look at the propensity and intensity of the bombing versus what is actually being targeted, it really does raise the question of exactly what rules of law are being followed here. Look, I was in Mosul in 2016 on the ground when the US military was having a go at ISIS. It did not look like this. I was in Fallujah in 2004 when the US military was having a go at what was then Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It did not look like this. The other key point to make here also that your correspondent was talking about, kind of laying the full blame of the control, being in the hands of Hamas. One also needs to remember that Israel controls the skies. Israel controls, to a certain degree, what happens on the ground. Those drones are buzzing all the time over the strip. Those gunmen that you showed in those images, they're perched on top of those convoys. That's not really what you see all that much of in Gaza. A lot of these looters and these criminal gangs that you see are armed with batons, they're armed with machetes. They're sort of throwing, makeshift barricades across the road and trying to stop a truck here and there. One of the big concerns actually among Gazans, and these are Gazans I'm talking to, is that because Hamas does not control Gaza, you have the emergence of these criminal gangs and these looters that are coming out. And this is why Gazans are afraid of the day after.
Ariel,
because
I saw that
not only does Hamas not control Gaza, nobody controls Gaza right now.
I mean, is that a fair allegation to make that Hamas is no longer in control of Gaza? Obviously, Israel's continuing its war with the target of eliminating Hamas both militarily and politically.
Let's put it this way. Their capabilities of ruling the Gaza Strip in terms of civilian capabilities and militarily have been significantly hurt. However, there is no other element that has more control over the Gaza Strip's day-to-day activity than Hamas. You could raise the argument that it's the IDF. That's an understandable point. But at the end of the day, in terms of internal elements, there is no other body more powerful and more controlling, even today, of the day-to-day workings in the Gaza Strip than Hamas. I'll give you an example. People in Gaza are saying, who are talking to us, they're saying that, describing how Hamas officials in Khan Yunis, they're the ones cleaning the streets. It's their bulldozers who are clearing the rubble. Hamas civilian officials, and so there is no other element that can do this. And these activities are still happening in areas that the IDF has also been operating. It's all happening under the auspices of Hamas.